The year is 1787, and Reverend Richard Johnson stands at the docks of Portsmouth, clutching a Bible and a handwritten letter of appointment. He's about to embark on an 8-month voyage to a place that doesn't even exist yet on most maps, a place the British government has designated for its most unwanted citizens. He's been told he'll be the chaplain to 1,000 criminals, sailing toward the edge of the known world. What he doesn't know is that he's about to become the first Christian clergyman to set foot in Australia, and the story of how that happens is far stranger and more troubling than you might imagine. Johnson wasn't supposed to be there. The Church of England had turned down multiple requests to send a chaplain on this first fleet. Why would they waste a good minister on convicts? But Johnson, earnest and idealistic, had volunteered. He believed every soul deserved salvation, even those who'd stolen bread or forged banknotes. As the 11 ships departed England, he had no idea that the government hadn't bothered to send any religious texts, no prayer books, no Bibles for the convicts, not even a single copy of the Book of Common Prayer. He had his personal Bible and little else. The fleet arrived at Botany Bay on January 20th, 1788, after a voyage that had claimed 33 lives. 8 days later, on what we now call Australia Day, Reverend Johnson conducted the first Christian service on Australian soil. But here's where the story gets interesting. He didn't have a church, he didn't have an altar, he didn't even have a proper tent. He stood under a tree somewhere near what is now Sydney Cove and preached to an audience of reluctant convicts, exhausted Marines, and skeptical officers. Governor Arthur Phillip attended out of duty, not devotion. Most of the convicts, shackled and starving after months at sea, couldn't have cared less about salvation. They wanted food, shelter, and freedom. Johnson wrote in his diary that night, "I have never felt so utterly alone in the service of God." He had no idea that his mission would become one of the most fascinating struggles in religious history. Now, you might think that bringing Christianity to Australia's penal colonies was a straightforward story of faith and civilization. But the truth is far messier. The British government wanted religion in the colony, but only just enough to keep the convicts docile. They didn't want revolution, they didn't want organized dissent, and they certainly didn't want the church questioning their brutal methods of punishment. Christianity was meant to be a tool of control, a way to convince thieves and prostitutes that their suffering on earth would be rewarded in heaven. But religion, as it turns out, is a dangerous thing to weaponize. It doesn't always behave the way the powerful want it to. For the first 18 months in the colony, Reverend Johnson conducted services without a church building. Think about that. In England, even the smallest village had a church. But here, in this raw settlement carved out of the Australian bush, the representative of God Almighty preached in the open air, sometimes in driving rain, sometimes in blistering heat. Governor Phillip kept promising to build a church, but there was always something more important: a storehouse, a hospital, a residence for officers. The message was clear: God could wait. Johnson used his own money to buy tools and materials. In 1793, 5 years after the settlement began, he finally built a church himself. He and his wife Elizabeth literally carried timber and hammered nails. The church stood on what is now the corner of Bligh and Hunter Streets in Sydney. It was a modest wooden building, capable of holding about 500 people. Johnson was so proud of it. He'd created the first purpose-built Christian church in Australia with his own hands. 2 years later, convicts burned it to the ground. The arson was never officially solved, but everyone knew why it happened. The convicts saw the church as an extension of their oppression. Sunday services were mandatory. If you didn't attend, you could be flogged. The sermons didn't speak of love and redemption. They spoke of obedience, submission to authority, and the fires of hell awaiting those who stole or rebelled. The church wasn't a sanctuary, it was another prison, this one for their souls. So they burned it. Johnson was devastated. He'd spent his own salary, sacrificed his health, and dedicated years to building that church. The government offered no compensation. In fact, Governor Philip Gidley King, who'd replaced Philip, suggested Johnson had brought it upon himself by being too severe in his sermons. The Reverend lasted another 5 years before sailing back to England, broken and disillusioned. He never returned to Australia. But Christianity didn't leave with him. It couldn't. By then, something unexpected had happened. The very tool of control the British had deployed had begun to evolve into something else entirely. Let me take you to Norfolk Island, one of the most brutal penal settlements in the British Empire. Between 1788 and 1855, this small island in the Pacific became synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. Men were sent there for crimes committed after they'd already been transported to Australia. It was effectively a prison within a prison. The Commandant, Captain John Giles Price, once said, "I consider the office of chaplain in this place to be entirely unnecessary." He was wrong. Enter Reverend Thomas Rogers, who arrived on Norfolk Island in 1834. Rogers was different from Johnson. He wasn't naive or idealistic. He'd seen the worst of humanity in England's slums, and he understood that these men, many of whom had been beaten, starved, and degraded beyond recognition, needed more than threats of damnation. They needed something to hope for. Rogers started conducting secret Bible study groups. Secret because the Commandant forbade gatherings of convicts outside of labor or punishment. The men would sneak into a storage shed after dark, and Rogers would read to them from the Gospels by candlelight. He focused on the stories of redemption: the woman caught in adultery, the thief on the cross beside Jesus, the prodigal son. He told them that no matter what they'd done, no matter how society had discarded them, they were still worthy of love. One convict, a man named William Riley, wrote in a contraband letter that was later discovered, "The Reverend spoke to us as if we were men. No one had done that in 7 years." Rogers' ministry was shut down after 6 months when authorities discovered the meetings, but by then, something had changed. Small groups of convicts continued meeting in secret, sharing prayers and readings. Christianity had become theirs, not the government's. Let me pause here to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Are you in Australia? Perhaps walking the same streets where these events unfolded? Or are you somewhere else entirely, maybe discovering this history for the first time? And what's your profession? Do you work in a field that brings you into contact with systems of justice or rehabilitation? Drop a comment and let me know. I'm genuinely curious about who's drawn to these stories. And if you're enjoying what Professor Archive brings to you, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps keep these deep dives into forgotten history coming. Now, let's talk about the women, because any account of Christianity in Australia's penal colonies that ignores the female convicts is telling less than half the story. The female factory at Parramatta was established in 1821. It was ostensibly a place where female convicts could work laundering clothes and picking oakum, but in reality, it was a warehouse for women the colony didn't know what to do with. Many had been transported for crimes of poverty, stealing clothing, or prostitution. Others had been convicted of infanticide, a crime that often resulted from desperate circumstances. The conditions were appalling. Women were crowded into dormitories, subjected to sexual abuse by guards, and given barely enough food to survive. Reverend Samuel Marsden, who served as the colony's senior chaplain from 1794 to 1838, saw the female factory as a particular moral challenge. Marsden was a complicated figure. He was known as the flogging parson because he served as a magistrate and frequently sentenced convicts to brutal whippings. Yet he also genuinely believed in the power of Christian redemption, particularly for women. Marsden established a chapel within the female factory and insisted that every woman attend services twice on Sundays. But unlike the punitive sermons delivered to male convicts, Marsden's sermons to the women focused on dignity and second chances. He brought in women from free settler families to teach literacy classes using the Bible as a textbook. Dozens of women learned to read for the first time in their lives through the Gospel of Luke. One woman, a convict named Mary Haydock, would later become Mary Ryby, one of the wealthiest businesswomen in early Australia. She attributed her transformation to the literacy and self-worth she gained through Marsden's programs. "I learned I was not merely what had been done to me," she wrote in her memoirs. Christianity, for her and others like her, became a pathway not to submission, but to reinvention. But not everyone saw it that way. The factory also housed women who despised religion, seeing it as another form of male control. There are records of women disrupting services by singing bawdy songs, and in one famous incident in 1827, 50 women turned their backs to the chaplain and refused to face him during his entire sermon. They were all sent to solitary confinement, but the message was clear. Faith couldn't be forced. By the 1820s, something remarkable had begun happening across the Australian colonies. Christianity was fragmenting. The Church of England maintained its official status, but other denominations were creeping in. Catholic convicts, most of them Irish, had been in the colonies from the beginning, but they'd been forbidden from practicing their faith. There were no Catholic priests in Australia until 1820, when two were finally permitted to arrive. Father John Joseph Therry and Father Philip Connolly stepped off the ship to find thousands of Irish convicts who'd been baptized Catholic but hadn't received the sacraments in decades. The Irish Catholics were a problem for the British authorities. They weren't just criminals. Many were political prisoners transported for rebellion against British rule. And for them, Catholicism wasn't just a religion, it was an act of resistance. Attending Mass meant rejecting the Protestant establishment that had colonized their homeland and now imprisoned them on the other side of the world. Father Therry was a firebrand. He openly criticized the treatment of convicts and demanded that Catholics be given the same rights as Anglicans. He clashed constantly with Governor Thomas Brisbane, who believed Catholics were inherently seditious. Therry didn't care. He traveled across the colony on horseback, saying Mass in barns and under trees, much like Reverend Johnson had done 30 years earlier. But where Johnson had preached submission, Therry preached dignity and justice. The Catholic community grew rapidly, and with it came schools, orphanages, and mutual aid societies. These institutions operated parallel to the official Anglican structures, creating a kind of shadow civil society within the convict colony. The British authorities tolerated it because they had no choice. By 1833, Catholics made up nearly a quarter of the population in New South Wales. Then came the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and even a handful of Baptists. Each brought their own vision of what Christianity should look like in this strange new land. The Methodists, in particular, found fertile ground among the lower classes. Their emphasis on personal conversion and emotional experience resonated with convicts in a way that the formal Anglican liturgy never had. Methodist preachers held revival meetings in the bush, where men and women wept and shouted and sang hymns late into the night. These gatherings terrified the authorities. They looked like the beginnings of insurrection. But they weren't. They were the beginnings of something else entirely. A uniquely Australian form of Christianity, shaped not by cathedrals and hierarchies, but by survival, defiance, and the need to find meaning in exile. Let me tell you about one more person. His name was George Augustus Robinson, and he arrived in Van Diemen's Land, what we now call Tasmania, in 1829. Robinson was a deeply religious Methodist with a mission that had nothing to do with convicts. He wanted to save the Aboriginal people. Now, this is where the story of Christianity in Australia gets truly dark. Because while we've been talking about convicts and chaplains and churches, there's another story happening simultaneously. The indigenous people of Australia had their own spiritual traditions that stretched back tens of thousands of years. They didn't need salvation, they didn't need saving, but Robinson and others like him believed they did. Robinson led what he called the friendly mission, which was neither friendly nor a mission in any moral sense. He convinced or coerced Aboriginal people to relocate to Flinders Island, promising them safety, food, and education. What he actually delivered was cultural genocide. Aboriginal people were forbidden from practicing their own ceremonies, forced to wear European clothing, and taught that their traditional beliefs were the work of the devil. Within a few years, disease and despair had decimated the population on Flinders Island. The introduction of Christianity to Indigenous Australians is one of the most painful chapters in the continent's history, and it happened concurrently with the story of Christianity among the convicts. The same God who supposedly offered redemption to British criminals was used to justify the destruction of ancient cultures. It's uncomfortable, but it's essential to understanding how Christianity became embedded in Australian society. It wasn't just about faith, it was about power, control, and the arrogance of believing that one way of understanding the divine was the only way. By the mid-1800s, transportation to Australia began winding down. The last convict ship arrived in Western Australia in 1868. By then, Christianity had become thoroughly woven into the fabric of Australian life, but not in the way the British government had intended. What started as a tool of oppression had evolved into something far more complex. It had been a source of comfort for some, a means of resistance for others, and a weapon of cultural destruction for still others. The churches that dotted the Australian landscape were built by convict labor, their stones carried by shackled hands. Many of those churches still stand today, monuments to a complicated legacy. Here's what strikes me most about this story. Faith doesn't remain static. It can't be controlled the way rulers wish it could. The Christianity that arrived in Australia aboard the First Fleet was meant to keep people in line, to make them accept their suffering without question. But human beings don't work that way. They take what's given to them and transform it into something that meets their actual needs, whether that's hope, community, resistance, or simply a reason to survive another day. Reverend Richard Johnson couldn't have imagined what would become of his mission. He returned to England thinking he'd failed, but in the decades after he left, churches sprouted across Australia, each one reflecting a different vision of what it meant to be a person of faith in a land of exiles. Some preached fire and brimstone, others preached liberation. Some built institutions that would last centuries. Others gathered in secret and left no trace except in letters and diaries. And all of it, every contradiction and complexity, is part of how Christianity came to Australia. This is Professor Archive, and thank you for taking this journey with me into one of history's most fascinating intersections of faith, power, and survival. If you found something valuable here, something that made you think or see history differently, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And remember, your super thanks genuinely help me continue researching and bringing you these stories that don't always make it into the textbooks. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never assume history is as simple as it first appears.